Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Rob Simonds, and I'm the board president of the Downtown Chamber Series. And tonight I am joined by cellist Ryan Murphy. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Ryan, you guys are going to present this program at the Icehouse, the iconic Icehouse in downtown Phoenix, where you're going to contrast and compare so called modern instruments, classical instruments, and historically informed classical instruments. And you pick this program, your half of the program is Byrd, Bach, and Beethoven, a different kind of three Bs, I suppose. And that spans several centuries of music, but you're going to use a unique set of tools to express this music and to realize this music. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so basically, the body of the instruments were created as we know them in 1500, and they're actually still instruments by Andrea Amati. I think is the earliest example we have around 1500, 1550, somewhere in there of string instruments, and they've more or less survived basically in that form. What we're going to be doing though is using an earlier style of strings known as gut strings. These are typically made from a small piece of the intestines of either sheep or cows. So they are not vegan, is the joke I used the other day or in a radio interview. And also the Baroque bow is something that I said is a little bit different. And I think those are the two big differentiations between a modern setup or a performance practice or a Baroque setup. The strings are a lot thicker, they're natural materials, so you generally have to get them warmed up because as they warm up, the pitch changes. As the temperature in the room changes, the pitch changes. So they're very I wouldn't say unstable, but they're very sensitive to whatever the conditions in the room and even of the player are. What the nice thing about them is you get a certain kind of warmth and a certain kind of rasp that doesn't really come across anymore on more modern strings, on steel strings. I like to compare it to the difference between analog records, LPs, and
Mhm.
digital or streaming media. They're just a certain je ne sais quoi that's missing. In addition to that, we're also using a different style of bow. Our bows are going to be made of snake wood, and unlike the concave where the bow is curved down, and it's got a very refined tip and has all sorts of different materials, these bows that we're going to be using are made of snake wood, which is a little bit easier to find wood than Pernambuco, which modern bows are made out of. It's generally from China. These are more convex shaped, so they look more like an archery bow.
Mhm.
And because of that design, they have a very, very different balance. There's almost no weight at the tip, so it makes it very, very difficult to sustain. And you'll hear that in a lot of, especially Baroque interpretation, but even in really good modern interpretations of Baroque music. There's a lightness and a lilt and almost kind of a freedom of movement, whereas romantic and later music tends to be much more sustained, much heavier, much louder generally
Mhm.
than Baroque music.
That's really interesting. You brought up an interesting point about the body of the instrument staying the same. So there was like this sudden surge of innovation in the 15th, the 16th and 17th centuries for string instruments. They talk about it like biological evolution, I think, in economics too, like a punctuated equilibrium where everything happens kind of all at once,
Yeah.
like this big explosion, and we've been left with this legacy of these instruments. But where the real innovation has happened in the past, let's say 100 years or so, has actually been in the strings themselves. Like you said, they're no longer a natural material; they're synthetic materials. So let's think about we get this bigger sound from these instruments that were invented 500 years ago, and then these different kinds of strings. Talk to us about how the technology of the instrument themselves changes from, let's say, William Byrd, a Renaissance composer, to J.S. Bach, a composer of the high Baroque period, into a classical composer and romantic composer like Beethoven.
Well, I think during John Dowland's time, of course, technology, especially in those days, takes a while to proliferate. So the instruments we were using, even though Andrea Amati had created the cello, the violin, viola, and even the bass as we know it today, those instruments probably were not widely available. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, the John Dowland piece that we're playing, "Flow My Tears," is actually generally done with singer and with lute, not viola and cello, because both of those instruments certainly during that time were not widely available or even
Mm-hmm.
considered solo instruments. So we're taking a little bit of freedom, which is okay, I think. And in Dowland's time, I think the viol family, which is kind of the precursor to the string family, so the viola da gamba, the viola braccio, those different kinds of and even the upright bass, as we noted, is actually technically a viol, which is why it has such a different shape. The shoulders slope,
I
and
didn't know that.
also why its tuning is weird. It's an old anachronistic, pre 1500s tuning from when viols kind of roamed the earth, so to speak. Um, so that's kind of really the difference, is that string instruments in their infancy were still kind of making their way across Europe and eventually replacing the viols, because of their power characteristics. There's just so much more power in the design of string instruments. There's a lot more flexibility in terms of how you can play them. They're not fretted, which would seem to make them harder to play, but it creates some more expressive opportunities that the viols might not have, particularly vibrato, for instance.
Mhm.
Um, so, and then in Bach's time, and especially with Bach, because he was at the very end of the Baroque era, string instruments were pretty much de rigueur. There weren't a whole lot of viol things. And there were some viol pieces that Bach wrote, but generally he was writing for string instruments, harpsichord, theorbo, things that were kind of still left over, lutes and all that sort of stuff. But string instruments were kind of standardized by that time. What
Mhm.
wasn't standardized, which is another interesting thing that people who are listening closely will notice, is that we're going to be using a different A tuning. Generally, most orchestras, most musicians these days tune to 440 hertz. It's kind of a standard, or 442. I think it's 441 in the symphony, but somewhere there's like a 3 or 4 hertz difference. We're going to be tuning to a much lower A at 415 hertz, and that's generally considered standard practice for early music nowadays. So that's creates a bit of a different timbre
Mhm.
with modern instruments. 20th century, all that stuff got standardized. Almost every orchestra by 20s, 30s, 1920s, 1930s is using steel strings, at least on the bottom. They're using modern bows. I think that was an innovation in the 1800s. They're also using end pens for cello, which I won't be using for our set. Um, Again, standardized tuning at around A440. Especially when recording came, all that sort of stuff started to kind of come more and more centralized, to the point now where it's not a big deal to play at a symphony in California and then go to Europe and play at a symphony in Germany and Frankfurt or something, and then go to China and play the Shanghai Symphony. The tuning is going to be the same. The rep is going to be very similar. That language, the international language of music has certainly become a lot more homogenized with technology these days.
So you by trade are a modern cellist. So tell us maybe what we've lost in some of this technology, and what have we gained with the newer technology. How audiences might think about that dichotomy that you talked about a minute ago, about the streaming technology versus the analog thing. We give up something to get something else. How might that be expressed in this technology?
Interestingly, I think ease of use and flexibility of use case is a lot simpler now. I think steel strings really allowed cello, and especially bass, to be much more soloistic, or much more. I mean, most of our concertos for those two instruments are written in the Romantic and the modern era. There's very little written for. I mean, I can think of maybe a couple of big cello concertos, and they're both by Haydn. In the
Mhm.
classical era, there's very few. I mean, Vivaldi wrote is a bit of an exception, but other than that, there's not a whole lot in the Baroque era. So it creates more opportunities because of that power to project over an orchestra. There's also, I think, a lot of different ways that you can play modern instruments, which makes it a little bit more democratic, a little bit more easy, especially if you're starting young to operate these instruments. I started when I was 3 on violin, and it's hard to make a sound on a violin that sounds nice when you're 3, but it's a lot
Mhm.
easier than it would have been with gut strings. But I feel like what we've lost is a little bit of that soulfulness, that character, um, that homogenizing effect that's happening. I feel like there were fewer schools of playing, but they were much
Mhm.
more differentiated. A Russian cellist is going to sound a lot different than American cellist, even at the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s. It's there's just something different there, something
Mhm.
more characterful in the playing, because you're limited so much more with what you can do and how you approach the string to get the instrument just to make a sound.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what drives the progress on the instrument. So I think what you're saying is, in some cases, maybe the player and the technique that you might have inspires makers to expand the instrument, or composers to write for it. But in this case, the technology kind of front runs the composers. In other words, Haydn wrote for what he had. There were two concertos, not much else. But as this technology advances, it creates a more soloistic instrument with more soloistic potential, and then this great body of repertoire follows after that.
Yeah.
So going back to your own story, so you came to the solo Baroque cello during the pandemic explicitly. Tell us about how you got focused and absorbed in that learning process.
Well, the thing with orchestra jobs these days is that they're very, very difficult to get. And I was, lucky that I had really decided when I was 18, growing up in St. Louis and watching the St. Louis Symphony, a lot of my heroes, I was lucky, were local cellists in this symphony that I really admired and looked up to. So I decided early on that that's what I wanted to do. The difficulty with that is that becomes your life, your kind of main focus in your career trajectory, working on orchestral excerpts, of course, learning cello technique, learning the orchestral repertoire, which at this point is vast. I mean, we're responsible for all of those hundreds of years, from the Renaissance to the current day, in knowing those different styles. And then, of course, getting familiar not with just the orchestral repertoire, but the orchestral excerpt repertoire, those little
Mhm.
pieces, best pieces for your instrument that get taken out. I mean, it can be up to an hour of music that you're responsible for or more for these multi-round big orchestral auditions. Um, so that was my focus all the way from, undergrad, grad school, years after grad school. Of course, I was doing, freelancing and all sorts of other teaching and different sorts of things. But getting that orchestra job was my main focus. Then I got an orchestra job, so I was really fortunate to get an orchestra job in San Antonio, and then filled my plate with some freelancing, some chamber music on the side, quite a bit of teaching, which I'm very passionate about. But really haven't didn't have the opportunity, the time, or the resources really to pursue the specialization that Baroque music requires. But during the pandemic, of course, everybody had a bunch of extra time. So I used that extra time to kind of go through and relearn some of the technical exercises on my modern cello. But I'm lucky enough to have a bunch of friends that are in the Baroque world, and two of them are world-class Baroque award-winning cellists. And I just reached out to them and said, "Hey, can I have a couple lessons and try and figure that out?" And, I've got a couple of extra cellos lying around the house, and would love to convert one over and see what there is, behind all of this. And kind of got a couple of crash course instructions on some basic Baroque principles and how to sit with the instrument. And, because, without the in pin, it's all very different. And some basic kind of stylistic pointers and some documentation to go along with that, to read through. And got asked by a friend of one of the people I was, taking lessons with, to play in her Baroque chamber music recital, and that got put on YouTube, and then I started getting other calls with,
Oh
"I re
wow,
have Baroque cello and we'll travel." It's kind of where I'm at now.
that's really interesting, Ryan. Thank you for sharing about this program and about your journey with this instrument. And I think it's really interesting that you're going to play this music that I associate with these big cathedral type spaces, and something like that in a more 20th century space in the Icehouse with these brick resonant walls and these very very high ceilings. Maybe not what the composers envisioned, but maybe sonically taking us back taking us back a few centuries. So these concerts are March 24th and 25th at 7:30 p.m. at the Icehouse in downtown Phoenix. Ryan, thank you for making time for us, and we look forward to everyone hearing this performance.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having us today.